Hello, Adam Gower here, and I build digital marketing systems for real estate professionals so you can find more investors, raise more money, and do more and bigger deals. Find out more at gowercrowd.com. Welcome to the Gower Crowd podcast, syndication in the digital age, with today's guest, Paul Fiorilla, who is Research Editorial Director at Yardi Matrix, where he oversees the production of research publications in support of Yardi Matrix, which is a division of Yardi Systems, who are a leading provider of property management software. Matrix tracks multifamily self-storage and office data properties in more than 130 markets nationwide, and their publications are amazing. Definitely check them out. Paul is one of the most intellectual guests that I've had on the podcast, and actually he and I enjoy a fairly frequent back and forth about all kinds of issues that really cover the gamut. He is a true pleasure to talk to and to get to know. It has been my great honor to be associated with him, and I'm delighted to have him on the podcast today. If you want to raise more money and do bigger and more deals, then we can help you do that here at gowercrowd.com. Just go to gowercrowd.com and use the contact page to reach me directly. Be sure to subscribe to my industry-leading newsletters. We have one on Wednesday that covers the latest in the real estate syndication or crowdfunding world. That comes out on Wednesdays, as well as an educational email that goes out every weekend. Everything, it's totally free. Sign up. You've got nothing to lose. That's it. And now for my guest, my great pleasure to introduce Paul Fiorilla, Research Editorial Director at Yardi Matrix. Paul, it's really a pleasure to see you again. Thanks for joining me. And so here's what I wanted to talk about today. You know, we spend all of our time teaching people or sponsors, real estate sponsors, that creating content is the single most important thing that they can do, and that they should create content and report basically on what it is that they are doing and the way they see the world. So what I wanted to talk to you about today, what makes for really good commercial real estate content? First of all, how do you decide what to write about? Or how to create, or what projects to work on, and then what is the actual process of putting that stuff together? I mean, you get on your phone or your computer and you pull up one of your research things and you look at it. It's really interesting, but the process of pulling those things together, I don't think people really know how tough that is to do well, and the reason that it's compelling and such high quality is because what happens behind the scenes. So I'm interested in understanding, what is the process for creating these, right? What are the steps that you have to go through, including the editorial part of it, and just like, how do you do it?
So first of all, Adam, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure getting to get to know you in recent times. As far as the process of creating, commercial real estate content. So, at Yardi, there's two different tracks, I guess I would call. One of them would be, our data. So, when I first started at Yardi had just bought a data firm, and the predecessor company did not have any kind of research, and in the industry, it's kind of standard for, service companies like data providers to publish research. Why? Well, one reason is to kind of highlight the fact that you have data. So, we started to think, what's the best use of our data that we could create publications that would be of interest to the audience, and create kind of a thought leadership reputation in the industry. So, we produce rent data, supply, all those, all the real estate fundamentals that have to do with the multifamily industry. So the first thing we did was we created a series of publications that involved Yardi's data. So, one of them would be, a national outlook where we do, beginning of the year, 2, 3 times a year, we will write an outlook. Hey, here's our view of the industry. Here's where we see rents going. Here's where we see, occupancy, supply, all those kind of things. So, what are the fundamental drivers of multifamily, and where do we see them going? The other element of that is then we created monthly publications for, we created a top 30 metros in terms of size, and then a month-to-month report on how they're doing as far as rent growth and employment. And so every month, our people who, and it's not, our research is published openly. There's no you just have to send an email address, and you don't have to pay for it. But what can we inform the market about that also involves kind of our expertise, right? So we could, you could write about anything, but we want it to be something that features our product, our data, and our area of expertise.
Interesting. So the research papers that you produce, and I might use the term that they are lead generation materials. Would that be fair, that you're delivering them for free to readers, anybody that gives you their email address, to showcase the data that you gather? And therefore, the content that you produce, the decision what to write about and what kind of papers to write about is driven by the data that you gather. Is that a fair characterization of how you decide what to write about?
Yeah, I mean, that's the first part of what I was just beginning to explain to you. That yes, I mean, when we started this operation, our first goal was to produce again brand awareness for Yardi's product. So that involves writing about the data that we have and that represents the core of our business. And then we went from kind of the monthly reports, then we started doing metro reports. So we have we publish first we started with 2 a month, and now we're up to 10 a month of metro reports. So of the top, I don't know, 30-40 metros, we publish about 3 times a year. People in those metros, we send it to the newspapers and the news outlets in those metros. So it gets, they get highlighted from there on the local level. And again, it's to, to highlight our data, kind of, I guess what you'd call content marketing. And then on top of that, we do kind of thought leadership, more generally, white papers. And for those, those don't have to be about our data. And that's where, my background, I've been in this industry for almost a quarter century, writing about different things, capital markets, all sorts of in-depth things about the industry. So, I take from my experience and kind of my understanding of what's going on in the market and say, hey, what's kind of an interesting thing that I can, write about and put a unique angle on. And so, I just wrote, the most recent thing I did was an analysis of the government-sponsored enterprises, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, what's going to happen to them before, Biden takes office, because the Trump administration appointees have their agenda, and Biden's agenda is likely to be a little bit different. So I did analysis about that. I've done an analysis of what's going on in the CMBS market. I did a piece recently. The CMBS market has come under fire. There have been some lawsuits filed against the CMB, the industry players in CMBS for selling loans that were written not, sort of, I don't know, fraud isn't the right word, but the allegations are that, that the lenders knew that the loan underwriting wasn't entirely on the level. And so there's some lawsuits, and the industry has gotten, there's been some, the Wall Street Journal wrote an article, ProPublica wrote an article. And I did a little bit of an analysis because I think, the industry has gotten a little bit unfairly tarred. And that's just, something that, from my background, my expertise, I covered the CMBS market in depth for a long time.
Paul, who is your audience when you're writing? Who are you seeing in front of you as being the people who are reading? Describe that.
Anybody is in the industry because, Yardi, we distribute the articles through, some Yardi channels. It's published. I publish also in, industry magazines. I'm, the editor-in-chief of the CRE Finance World magazine. I'm on the editorial board of the PREA, the Pension Real Estate Association, and I publish sometimes. So I publish in, a variety of industry publications, magazines, quarterly magazines, NAREIM and AFIRE, different industry groups, trade groups that publish things. So I publish through that. But, and then we also distribute through Yardi's client base, Yardi's social media. And, I have, my own following on, social media, on LinkedIn and different things that I publish. So, and a lot of it gets picked up by newswires. So, Globe Street or different newswires sometimes will pick up, NREI. Some of these newswires will pick up the pieces that we write and run their own piece. So, there's a whole real estate media content ecosystem,
right,
where these things can get published in.
But here's what I was getting at when I said about the audience that you're writing to. Because you say the industry, the first time that you and I connected, when we first spoke, it was about crowdfunding. And the industry that you speak to, and correct me if I'm wrong, let's kind of exploring this with you. The industry that you speak to doesn't really know what crowdfunding is, or if they've heard of it, don't think it very highly of it. It's maybe the wrong term, but just think it's a very peripheral, sideshow kind of thing. So you're talking to whereas the world that I speak to, everybody thinks that it's the center of the universe. Right. So what is your audience? Is it an institutional world?
When I say the industry, right, I would consider my industry, when I'm talking about my industry, to be sort of the institutional commercial real estate market. So you would be talking about, pension funds and sovereign wealth funds and, REITs, and the industry has a lot of phases. There's advisors, consultants, lawyers, servicers. There's a whole battery of different types of organizations that comprise that, not just the investors and owners. So that Yardi's main business is software for property managers. So that's another element of the industry.
And is that are those property managers? Are they institutional property managers, or can they be somebody that owns 100 unit building somewhere?
Yeah, the industry runs the gamut. Most of from mom and pop all the way up to equity office properties, or something like that, or that they don't exist anymore. I'm sorry, equity residential, or Simon Properties, or Blackstone, and there's a whole range of ownership.
And your products service all of them, do they? The whole gamut.
Yeah, Yardi has products for institutions, and it has products for middle market, I guess, if you call it that. So yeah, Yardi runs the gamut.
And so when we did first speak, just tell me what what is the view of the industry, as you understand it, of crowdfunding? It's kind of spin back to that first question.
Right. Well, the institutional real estate market, which owns the vast, majority of sort of larger, buildings, when you're looking at malls and, multi-tenant apartment buildings and, office towers and all those kind of things. The vast majority of that is owned by the institutional world. And, the institutional world generally looks at the, crowdfunding as sort of, the, smaller sources of capital. And, the retail, I guess you'd call it retail capital. Retail capital has had historically kind of a rough, up and down, very volatile relationship to and commercial real estate. So, I mean, you go back to in my lifetime, you go back to say the 1980s when there were a lot of these kind of syndicates set up with, the retail investors and, doctors and lawyers and all these kind of partnerships. And after the tax reform in was it 86 or whenever,
Yeah.
They were set up for tax reasons. And then you had the S&L crisis and a lot of that involved buildings owned by smaller, less institutional kind of property companies. And that all blew up. And, you go to say then the non-traded, REIT market, which was set up. And, that has had a very volatile history over the last 20 years. So, I mean, I think from the institutional point of view, the people in that market they've had their ups and downs as well, but generally they're able to survive it. And I think that they look at non-sophisticated sources of capital as being unable to deal with kind of the problems that come along that are inherent, in a market that's kind of has a history of being up and down.
Does that also speak to, okay, so you said that the source of the
capital, because I think, so when, let's say you have sort of a tenant issue, when you have like a small ownership situation, a lot of times they don't have the expertise to deal with a workout. Or, you have management, it's one thing to own a property, but managing is another. So, somebody that has deep pockets has a better chance at, being able to provide the CapEx needed when something, happens to the building. And dealing with, complex financial instruments, being able to structure a complex mortgage that maybe is more appropriate for your needs, maybe, so they have more expert kind of, staff that's able to handle that kind of thing. Historically speaking, I'm not saying that retail, nobody involved in the retail world has that kind of expertise or is able to handle problems. But by and large, there is a certain amount of expertise that goes with owning a commercial building. And, if I were to just, somebody were to just buy a building and all they know is, hey, I'm just going to give you the money and they don't really know anything about, the market and, how to lease a building and all the things that go with, owning a building. The institutional owners look at themselves as being better able to handle the hurdles that come up. And historically, that's true. So, I mean, I think.
Yeah, it's but that presupposes that crowdfunding is only in the domain of the inexperienced. A lot of companies, and particularly in the last year or so, a lot of companies are very well established professional real estate sponsors who have decided that it is more in their better interest to raise money from in the tens of millions, not trivial amounts of money either. It's not tens or hundreds of thousands, but tens of millions of dollars on individual deals to raise it from retail investors, from accredited investors, rather than going to institutional capital.
Yeah. And I'm not arguing. I mean, I don't know, I don't have the personal knowledge of what you're, referencing. I'm just telling you, you asked me what the market, the world that I kind of live in, work in, what they think. And the beginning when crowdfunding became, when crowdfunding was sort of created by, kind of the regulations and the legislation back in about 10 years ago. A lot of the companies that started that, did run into problems as well. So now maybe, what's emerged out of that is kind of, stronger crowdfunding companies that have taken to heart the lessons. But at the beginning, they, again, the institutional market looked at it as, look, there's a bunch of kids who know how to run websites, but they don't know anything about and a lot of, but you looked at the crowdfunding companies, some of the ones that started and got notoriety 8-10 years ago, they didn't have any background in commercial real estate. They knew how to raise money. And so that's kind of been the perception in the institutional world.
So let me ask you though, and this is actually, I'm interested in your insight. Now, you've had a successful career also as a very well-known journalist. I know that. And so you've been able to identify themes and topics that the industry will be interested in. That requires a deep understanding of the industry and understanding what questions they're asking. So I'm in that context, I would ask you this. When you talk about this is what the industry, the institutional industry, thinks about crowdfunding, is that based on conversations that you've had with people on the institutional side, or is that based on your instinct and intuition, based on your knowledge of what they think and how the institutional investor thinks?
Both. I mean, crowdfunding right now, to be honest, is not something that people are worried about at the moment. People in the industry, there's a lot of things going on, and it's not a current topic in the institutional world. But a few years ago, there was a lot of discussion when crowdfunding, again, when the regulatory changes enabled it and kind of created an easier pathway to raise the money. A few years back, it did become quite an issue of discussion, and I was on the board of a company that started as a crowdfunding company and never really got going, but so I was involved a little bit to some small degree in the industry itself, but yeah, I mean, most of what I'm saying is from kind of the discussions, going back to when it was kind of in the public consciousness.
So that was where I was headed, was how do you decide on what to write about or what research to conduct? I know we've talked about the foundation being the data itself, but for example, you've talked about starting with a national overview of the multifamily industry, and then drilling down on individual locations and different cities, etc. But so how do you decide what's going to be the next white paper, for example? It's a big project, presumably. We'll talk about how you put those things together as well. How do you decide what it's going to be about?
Well, I'll have discussions with my team, and we're looking at what's going on in the market at any given time. What's happening. When you look at the real estate fundamentals, you look at the capital market conditions, and I guess the foundation, the kind of the basic element in research that you're trying to get across, or you're trying to help people with. People want to know how to run their right. People are interested in, how do I run my business? How do I plan for the future? So the way I look at it, everything I write, it's what am I going to write that tells people what to expect and what they can, conceive of and think about, what data, what trends will help them to kind of decide what's going on in the market, and how that helps them manage what they're going to do going forward. I think that's basically, research is a big part of the industry. Data firms like ourselves, even, I was at Prudential and their research group, they were investor, and they had research because they wanted, kind of be thought of, they still do have research, they want to be thought of, kind of in terms of their thought leadership. So they want people in the market to say, hey, we're smart, we have good thoughts, we have an understanding of what's going on. You can feel confident in investing with us. So as a data provider, it's kind of the same thing. Hey, look, we have a good understanding of what's going on. You can trust what we're doing here. And when people, I think, click on the Yardi website and go to the research page, I think they're looking for things that help them to, hey, should I buy? Should I sell? I mean, they're not looking specifically to say, hey, I'm going to read this and then decide to buy or sell anything in particular. But, to get there, they're trying to understand what's going on and where everything's going.
So would it be fair to say that you put yourself in the mind of your reader and think about what are the questions they're asking today, and then answer those questions, kind of preempting, basically putting yourself in the shoes of your readers? Is that where you start when you think about a white paper?
Yeah, that's definitely one of the main things that we would think about. I also think about, sort of create a theory of what you think is going on, and then, try and run some data and see, how that matches up to what you're, what's going on. And, sometimes you find that, maybe the data doesn't say what you think, was going on. And so you got to figure out then, all right, do I, did I just, run the wrong set of numbers? Do I, are my, my calculations, am I looking at the wrong correlations here? Or, maybe there's just something different that I, is going on than what I think about. So like one interesting example of that would be, during the pandemic, multifamily, well, before the pandemic, multifamily, pretty much all the markets, rent growth is positive for, 7-8 years. And now post-pandemic, suddenly, there's a big divergence. Some metros are doing better than others. Some are negative. Some are still positive. Everybody's down, but some are still positive. Some went to the negative territory. So suddenly you have, half the top 30 metros or half the top 50 metros are negative instead of positive, after being, entirely positive, except, one or two exceptions like Houston after Hurricane Harvey, went negative. But for the most part, there's been almost no negative rent growth in multifamily year over year since the beginning of the last cycle. So, what is causing that? And we ran some numbers to do with, occupancies and demand and absorption. But the one thing that, when we were running all these different numbers, job growth, and, the one thing that, sometimes, you when you're doing like one of those scatter plots and you want to get like a line that goes like in one direction, or, everything lines up and you think, oh, so that's it, If you have a scatter plot and everything is all over the place, and you're like, oh,
Like, what the heck's going on, right? Exactly.
Yeah. So then it's not so obvious. But the one thing that the line like was pretty much in a straight line was, where the correlations were really, really strong, was expense, right? So the more expensive the market was, the worse they did in terms of rent growth. The cheaper the market was, the better it did. So
expense measured by
average rent, right? By the
average rent, not the relationship between rent and income.
Just the average rent, right?
Okay.
And so Las Vegas lost, their they lost a greater percent of jobs than any other metro in the U.S., but their rents growth was positive. The second worst metro in terms of losing jobs was New York City, and this is between March and September, and they were minus like 8% or something like that for rent. So when we looked at what the correlation was, the biggest factor was all the most expensive markets were pretty much the worst markets in terms of rent growth. And even so, there was a stronger correlation between that. Now, there were pretty strong correlations to other things, like you said, but the strongest correlation for anything was just expense. And when you think about it, it makes sense that, we're at a period where there's, a lot of uncertainty. A lot of people have lost jobs, and most of the people who've lost jobs are mostly, kind of on the lower end of the economic scale. So there's a lot of more, budget conscious renters out there. So just, just as an example of, when you're talking about how do I decide what to write, you kind of think of what is happening in the market, try and write something that'll help people understand, hey, what's causing, rents to go up or down, what's causing demand to be strong or weak, so on and so forth. And then you run, numbers and tests and try and decide, what makes the most sense.
Paul, this is extremely interesting, and it's definitely not quite down the fairway of what I was wanting to talk about, but I do want to drill down on this because it's absolutely fascinating. What you've talked about is a correlation between rent declines and expense. But that's not a cause. That's just a correlation. Right? So the only way that rents can decline is if people move. Right? If you're in it, right? So what is actually causing those rent declines? Are you seeing, I'm going to kind of guess what it might be. Are you seeing migration out of expenses?
Yes, no, definitely. I mean, that's that's the other part of the story. I mean, you could go on the website and read the paper and we talk about all this, but yeah, so the most expensive markets are the big coastal gateway metros, right? New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Silicon Valley. So they have had an out-migration. You think of New York and San Francisco, big examples of that. They were among the hottest markets for a long time. And, with the pandemic, people don't want to be crowded together, for one thing. So the occupancy rates in those metros have dropped pretty dramatically over the last 6-7 months. But why? Because people, people want to live there because of the great things to do. They're great places to live. They're cool. They're, everything about, they're fun. But none of that stuff's available right now. So you got, things going in a couple directions. One, the things that make those cities livable and fun aren't really available. So that's not there. Number two, the offices are closed. So people who were living there because, they didn't want to commute an hour and a half to work. I live, in northern New Jersey. I don't live that far from the city, but it takes me an hour and a half to get into the city, right? Just the way the trains, transportation, blah, blah, blah. So people who now they don't have to commute, right? They don't have to be there. So some people, are moving out either into the suburbs outside of those gateway metros, or they can be anywhere if they, their company lets them work remotely for a long period of time. And the third thing is, the expense, people who, again, have, maybe they were, living in co-living arrangements in, kind of one of these walk-ups in, Queens or Brooklyn or something, and just sharing an apartment with somebody. And, maybe they're working as, a barista or working at a hotel or something. And those jobs have been lost, right? The people who had those jobs now can't afford even, the high cost of that. So they're moving back to their parents or just moving somewhere else. So, yeah, it's complicated. It's not just the expense, obviously, but it's a big part of the equation, right? Because of the, the particulars of what's going on. now.
And so you're seeing increases in rent in low rent markets, suggesting that people are migrating to those low rent
Right.
markets and increasing demand.
So for example, Las Vegas, people in California, it's not that far from Southern California.
Mhm.
So you could move to Las Vegas and live very cheaply compared to California. And if your rent goes up 2-3%, it's like, wow, it's still cheap.
Right. And do you think there's going to be, and we need to wrap up, I've just looked at the time, I cannot believe how fast this has gone, Paul. It's always like this with you. We spend an hour talking, I feel like it's 5 minutes. But do you think, I'm going to ask you 3 sign-off questions, so that's what we're moving to, but I do have one final question about this. Do you think that this is going to spring back once the vaccine rolls out and everybody, breathes a sigh of relief on each other, right? Goes out and communicates again?
Yeah, it will, but it'll take time, and it depends on kind of a lot of details. Look, I wrote a piece back in, I think it was May, right? When we were still early into this, and everybody thought it wasn't going to last very long. But here's my view on this, right? Cities have grown tremendously over the last couple of decades, right? We've had this whole urban movement because it provides the urban the gateway markets and other urban areas in secondary markets. It's not just the gateways, but urban parts of you know Charlotte and in Phoenix, and those have grown tremendously because the urban areas provide the lifestyle that people want, right? My generation, everybody, I saw some stat where back in, I was like the 1950s, 85% of people in their 25 to 29-year-old category were married and had kids. And, today it's like 30%. So, people are getting married later. Young people are wanting to, they're going to have fewer children. They want that experiential, lifestyle. And so the cities provide that type of thing. My kids' generation doesn't really want, the picket fence and suburban and cutting the lawn on Saturday and that kind of thing.
Right.
They don't want it. They don't care. They don't want to own cars. So they have to live next to a train station. So the cities provided that kind of lifestyle. People, that doesn't exist right now. Once there's a vaccine, it'll come back. When people feel safe, I think they'll eventually move back because, I think that's what people want out of life, right? Even, the 2 big drivers of demand in the urban areas were sort of the millennials, but also the baby boomers, the retirees who, they don't need, the 4-bedroom houses after their kids moved out. So, and they didn't want to just, go to Sarasota where there's nothing to do. So they're renting, they might be selling their houses and renting a place in downtown Boston or, downtown, San Francisco, because there's things to do and they're not ready to just sit back and spend the rest of their lives sitting on the beach or something. I think the cities will recover. I think it'll, the longer the pandemic goes and affects, the ability to do things, the longer it will take to recover. So it might take a couple of years, but I think eventually, we will get back to where we were. I mean, there's plenty of other factors too, like immigration, the gateway metros, their growth there's been sort of a domestic out migration from them for a long time, and that's not new, but their population has grown because that's kind of a landing spot for immigrants. So our immigration policy is if we start becoming more welcoming to immigrants, that's also a positive for gateway cities, in my view. And I mean, I think they'll recover. I think it's going to take a little time, but I think that's what people want.
Well, we're going to have to wrap up, unfortunately. And I've thrown in one extra question to my last 3. And I'll put you on the spot a little bit. First of all, the multifamily paper, the report that you just put on, dying to see that. I would like to include it on the show notes page. So after when we sign off, let's make sure that you send me a link to that so I can include that and distribute it as well. So
Okay.
so I've got three final questions, but one before that. The first one is, you and I had a very interesting conversation last night. Nothing at all last time, nothing at all to do with real estate. I really enjoyed it. It gave me a lot of thinking. And I talked about it with my wife that evening as well. Very interesting conversation. Do you have any books that you recommend that I read? Anything comes to mind that you think would be an interesting book to read about any topic?
Oh, I don't know. That's a good question. You know, I mean, most of what I read is like history stuff. So I don't know.
So, all
It's
right, a good history book.
ancient history.
Well, one of my favorite books is The Fatal Shore, which is the story of how Australia was colonized. It is absolutely amazing. All right, so what's your favorite history book? I love history.
Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to think about it a couple minutes, and I don't know.
All right, so let me ask you these
around in
final
my
questions.
library or something.
All right, let me think of that. All right, so that's all. We'll put that on hold. Don't worry. I told you I'd put you on the spot. I don't mean to make you feel uncomfortable. So three final questions. What are you? These are rapid, like lightning round. What are your personal daily habits that keep you successful?
Well, I'll leave it to others to judge whether I'm successful or not. But look, the first thing I'm a fanatical runner, and the first thing I do is I get up and I do some stretches and exercises, and then I go, for a run. I started running in high school back in the 1970s and never finished. And it's great to, for me, I enjoy it, and it's good for your mental and physical health. And so, I do that, and keep abreast of, kind of the news, and keep up what's going on in the world, and try and eat healthy.
How far do you run? Just curious. How far do you run?
Well, 3 to 5, my average 3 to 5 miles a day.
Right.
You know,
3 to 5 miles. So for me,
I
that
don't
would be
run the same. I mean, I try and do long runs, and sometimes I try and do speed work, and it's harder as you get older to stay healthy and all that. But yeah, I mean, I've been running seriously for a long time, and it's the first thing I do every day.
very nice. Second question, 3. What's the hardest lesson you've learned throughout your career in business related?
Well, I guess I guess you have to sort of understand. I mean, one thing that I've tried to, I think what's made when I'm writing, and I think what makes my writing stand out. I mean, there's a lot of written material in the industry, but I think what makes mine stand out, is sort of the perspective that I bring to it. I try and bring to it sort of a deeper, more sophisticated perspective than other people who are right now. So like when I mean, I was a journalist, and now I'm on the other side of things. I get interviewed sometimes, and I read what's written, and I say, that's kind of what I said, but that doesn't really what I meant, and I think I've tried, and I think, I think one of the reasons that people appreciate what I write is I think I'm able to capture kind of the perspective of what's going on, not just, the words of what's going on, but to try and, capture the big picture nuance of the market and the trends.
It's really interesting. It's a language, isn't it, Paul? I mean, it's a language. It's a use of a language. The reason I say that is I remember when I was in Japan, I had learned to speak Japanese. Some of the senior execs from Universal and Paramount, who I was working for, would come out to Tokyo. Of course, they didn't speak any Japanese, and the Japanese didn't speak any English, so I had to interpret. And the key was not just translating the words from one side to the other, but was interpreting them, was actually translating them in a way that the nuance was conveyed. That's what you're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I've tried to do that, and I think that's something that makes when I write about things now, I write articles. I write for Yardi Research. I also write articles, what I guess you'd call analysis, a news analysis for CPE and MHN. And I just try and put a unique spin on it. I mean, I don't cover things as a beat, but so when I write about something, to get a kind of a voice that's a little bit different from everyone else.
That ties into my last question. For somebody who is wanting to write content for the commercial real estate industry, and you know that my audience are sponsors primarily who want to communicate with prospective investors, but as they think about what they're going to write about, what advice would you give them for deciding what to write about?
Well, I guess I would try and, like you said before, I would think of your audience, right? And what is their, what do they need, right? What are they looking for? There's an awful lot of content in this industry. Everybody has content. There's a million. I mean, every day I get news, I get all these news wires, and I get, research from, all my competitors and other data firms and brokers. And there's just no end to the amount of written material, and people don't have a lot of time. So how much do they click on it and read it? So I would think of, if you're sending it to somebody, what's going to make them click on it? And what is going to help them, right? What is going to serve their kind of needs as a reader? And what can you tell them about, what, I guess kind of ground everything in kind of a future looking, voice, right? Because that's what they want. And that doesn't mean, you don't write about what's happened, because that's a big part of it, but, interpret the future through the past, right? So even if you're writing about the past, kind of think of like, well, what does this mean to the reader? So, and when I say, what will get them to click, I don't mean, you could send a picture of Kim Kardashian or whatever, and they'll click on it, but that's not what I mean, obviously. Something that's both, interesting and useful, and that's a lot harder than it sounds.
Perfect. It is exactly. Paul, what's your actual title? I want to sign off now. What's your title at Yardi?
Director of Research at Yardi Matrix.
Paul Fiorilla, Director of Research at Yardi Matrix. A pleasure as always. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. It was fun to talk to you.
That was Paul Fiorilla, Research Editorial Director at Yardi Matrix. If you are a real estate professional and you would like to have a significantly better social media presence without actually having to spend any time doing that while generating leads for your deals, then you are in the right place. Contact me and I will help you do just that. Go to gowercrowd.com, use the contact page to reach me directly, and while you're there, be sure to subscribe to our newsletters. The Wednesday newsletter covers real estate syndication and crowdfunding news updates, and the weekend edition always has some free educational content that will move you forwards in your mission to raise more money online. That's it. Thanks for listening. And thank you, Paul Fiorilla. Really nice seeing you today, Paul. Research Editorial Director at Yardi Matrix, for your time with me today. That's all for this episode. I'll see you next time, and in the meantime, stay well. And for now, this is Dr. Adam Gower signing off.